John. I'm delighted you're joining us for today's ESPC community webinar. Today I'm joined by Kevin Pereira, who will cover SQL and Fabric era, translate existing skills into the modern data platform. We love hearing guys that say, so remember join and be sure to join conversation about today's webinar and more on X. Our handle is at ESPC_community and our hashtag is ESPC26. Tweet us, tag us, and tell us what you learned. Don't forget to check out our Learning Hubs to update the latest blogs, ebooks, webinars, and how-to videos. You can access the Learning Hub by visiting espc.tech and clicking the Learning Hub tab at the top of the page. Don't forget to join us for our next webinar, Agentic Development for Power BI with Matthias Halkjar. This is taking place tomorrow, Friday, the 17th July, 11 a.m. CEST. Time's ticking. Your future network is waiting. Don't miss the conversations, insights, and opportunities everyone will be talking long after the event ends. Secure your place today and in the room where it happens. Save €300 with code Fabric Week when you book your ticket. Before you switch on your out of office, make one last move. Secure your place at FabCon and SQLCon Europe in Barcelona and take advantage of our early bird rates. Book by the 31st of July to lock in early bird pricing and then use code Fabric Week to save an additional €300 on your ticket. Enjoy your summer knowing your place is reserved for Europe's leading Microsoft Data and AI conference. Win Lego from Acteres. Scan the QR code to enter today for your chance to win Lego from Microsoft Fabric Week sponsor Acteres. As always, if you have any questions at any stage during the webinar, please feel free to type in the chat box and Kevin will get to them during the session. This webinar will be recorded and added to Resource Center, where you'll be notified by email when it's available. And now I'm going to hand you over to today's presenter. Hello, Kevin. Thanks for joining us today.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here today. I am Kevin Pereira, and I seem to be having a bit of issues with my connectivity right now. So please, Sean, give me a thumbs up or let me know if it gets choppy at any point in time.
I'll let you know if you want to start
sharing. Going ahead and starting to share my screen. Let me know once that becomes available.
Yeah, I can see it perfectly. Thanks, Kevin.
All right, so thank you for being here with us today. As I mentioned, I'm Kevin Pereira. I am a solutions architect with a company called SHI. And I'm here to talk to you guys about SQL and Fabric. This presentation is intended to help bridge the gap between the SQL community and the Fabric community. And I really want to showcase how those of us that have a heavy background in SQL can actually go ahead and use our existing skills in Fabric rather quickly and demonstrate value. So a little bit about me. I've been working with SQL for a really long time. I have about 20 years of working directly with SQL Server. 15 of those years has actually been doing ETL and data engineering. And I've also spoken at multiple SQL Saturday events, or nowadays they're called Day of Data in the US. Spoken virtually for many user groups across the world. I've also spoken at FabCon in the US, FabCon EU, and SQLCon in the US. And I lead a virtual user group that is called the DFW Power BI and Fabric user group. You can find us on Meetup if you ever want to join to get additional free training and free sessions from MVPs from across the world. If you would like to connect with me, feel free to scan the QR code and that will send you directly to my LinkedIn, and just leave a note saying that you saw me here on the ASPC webinar this week, and I'll be happy to connect with you. All right, so what we're going to be covering today, we're gonna start by taking a quick look at the SQL database in Fabric. We're going to just kind of do a very high level Fabric architecture overview. Then we're going to quickly start moving into some of the features that are unique to the SQL database in Fabric, one of which happens to be the automatic mirroring or replication of the database into something that's called the analytics endpoint. Then we're going to be covering the analytics endpoint, just going to show you what it is, what it isn't, and how you can leverage it. we're going to then apply some of our SQL skills to do querying across endpoints, so that it's going to cover SQL database, it's going to cover the Fabric data warehouse, and it's also going to cover the Fabric Lakehouse. Then we're going to move on to things that are more along the lines of governance and security. So we're going to take a quick look at lineage view and the impact analysis view, and just talk a little bit about what the advantages are for having those particular views in Fabric. And then lastly, we're going to go into SQL-based data protections across, database and the endpoint. So what does that mean? We're going to cover dynamic data masking. We're going to cover row level, column level, and object level security, how they're the same but also different, where you need to apply them and what the gotchas are, and then some of the impacts that they can have on those downstream objects, such as Power BI reports. So let's just go ahead and dive in. What is SQL database in Fabric? This is Microsoft's definition, not my definition, and I like to use it because it's really broad. But it is a developer-friendly transactional database that allows you to create operational databases in Fabric. Now, one thing that I want to highlight in there is going to be the fact that it's developer-friendly. So what that means really is that in the old days of SQL Server and even in Azure SQL Database or Managed Instance, we always required to have our DBAs and or our infrastructure team come in and just kind of set up the services and or set up servers and databases for us, leading to some waiting around to be able to get started. Now, with a SQL database in Fabric, being that is developer friendly, and being that Fabric is a platform as a service, it's a software as a service platform, we can just simply click a button, say create a new database, and we are done. We're ready to go. So that is great. Now, the other part of this sentence talks about how it uses the same database engine as the Azure SQL database. And that's really important for a couple of reasons. This is not a brand new product that was stood out from the ground up, where you may have some lacking features or you may have some bugs. It's the same thing that we've been using for many years. It's just presented a little bit differently in a different tenant, and it just works. It just works. So the advantages of that is that when you are inside of the Fabric platform, you kind of go into this whole unified experience that Microsoft has put together. So you see that they put databases up front and in the middle here on this particular diagram. But the idea behind it is that you are supposed to transactional workloads, you're able to do analytical workloads and all of those things in the same platform without having to stitch all of these different services together. Now, taking a quick look at the architecture of SQL database in Fabric, we can start here on the left-hand side. We have the database, and as I mentioned a second ago, it is just like the Azure SQL database. In fact, it's the same engine. It is the serverless version of the engine. And then over here on the right-hand side, you can see that we have the SQL Analytics endpoint. So what that Analytics endpoint really is just a method for us to be able to use the T-SQL language to access the data that is stored in one lake in Delta Parquet format. So great, I have two different parts, but how do I actually ensure that the data that's in my database is what gets presented in the Analytics endpoint? So that's where this near real-time replication comes into play. If you've been working with the technologies in Fabric and SQL Server for a while, you've probably heard of the concept called mirroring, where you can bring in data from outside of Fabric into one lake from many different sources, SQL being one of them. So it is the same concept. It's just built in. It's built right into the service. So whenever you actually generate the SQL database, it automatically creates the Analytics endpoint. It automatically starts the mirroring process. And as you start creating your tables and adding your data into the database, it just automatically replicates all of that. And the advantages of that replication is that then you can access that same data from all these different workloads. It can be the data warehouse, the lakehouse, Spark, or even Power BI semantic models directly. So diving in a little bit more on the mirroring, here, as I mentioned a second ago, it replicates the transactional data into one lake in near real time. So there's the concept of zero ETL at this point. 15 years ago, even 5 years ago, what we needed to do is engage data engineering teams to say, hey, I need to build a pipeline so that I can get my data from this database over here into a data warehouse of some sort, so that we can then start building semantic models on top of it so we can do analytics on it. That took time, that took effort. So being able to have this zero ETL process built into this is really advantageous, particularly for those citizen developer apps or even departmental apps where you don't necessarily have the time or the bandwidth to wait on your IT team or your data warehouse team, because let's be honest, they're pretty busy too. Now, the data in the endpoint and in OneLake is stored in Delta Parquet files, so that makes them ACID compliant. What that means is that it supports transactions, it supports inserts, updates, and deletes, and it's able to keep track of all of that for us. Now, one thing that I think Microsoft did really good with on what mirroring in general, whether it's just for the SQL DB or outside of the SQL DB, is that the compute needed to do the replication is actually free. It does not consume any of your CUs whatsoever from your Fabric platform, so that is advantageous. And if you think through it about it through the lens of Microsoft, it's bringing all of your data into the platform so that you use it more and stay in it. Now, the other part of it that I like is that the storage for mirroring in OneLake is free with a caveat. So it's tied to the size of the SKU of the Fabric that you have actually purchased. So if you happen to have an F2, you are going to be getting 2 terabytes of free storage for the replication of the SQL database. If it's an F4, it's going to be 4 terabytes and so on. Now, you can go over that limit, but then you have to pay just regular storage prices, which is relatively low. Actually, it's super low. And then the other thing that I wanted to highlight here about this process, as I mentioned a second ago, is that it's all enabled for all tables right off the bat. So there's zero effort for you to do that. As tables show up in your database, they will automatically show up on your analytics endpoint pretty quickly. Now, some data types are not compatible. Some data types in SQL just don't pair well with the Delta format, and that's a limitation of the Delta format. Microsoft has done a great job at getting the majority of those widely used data types in there. But if you're working with something like a var binary, it's not going to replicate into the endpoint. Now, the good news is that it will replicate the table. It will replicate all the other columns except for that one, as opposed to just simply failing to replicate the table and you're not having the table at all. So in order to monitor the replication, what we do is, and we'll get into it here in a demo shortly, but we go into Fabric, into the web portal, and then we can see here that I highlighted here, there's the ribbon at the top, and there's a menu called replication. And once we click into that, there's going to be this button called Monitor Replication. The screenshot is a little bit older. There's a second button that's available now that we'll get into it in the demo. But then that's going to open this blade over here, and then it's going to start showing us the different tables that we have in the database. And you can see it's not a very big database. I only have, 7 tables here, but all of them are being replicated. Everything is running. It's showing me the last completed date as of the time that I took the screenshot. And you can see that the number of rows replicated pretty quickly. So now let's go ahead and talk really quickly about what the analytics endpoint is, and then we're going to dive into a demo. So as I mentioned, the analytics endpoint is a T-SQL compatible interface that is automatically created for the SQL database. It allows us to query that those Delta tables in OneLake that you would think it provides a special skill. And maybe you're thinking, oh no, it's Delta Lake. This is a Databricks thing, so I need to know Spark and I need to know Python, but I don't know Python and Spark, so maybe I can do that. No, that's not the case. Through the SQL endpoint, we can actually just use the regular T-SQL that we know and love, and go ahead and query the data, and it comes back as an end user. I'm none the wiser. It just looks like a database to me. And I think that's really, really, really advantageous. It also allows us for the definition of objects, views, functions, and procedures, and also SQL security. And that is something that is really interesting to me because, as I say here on this first bullet point, it's a read-only T-SQL compatible interface. So every time that I think of read-only, I cannot modify it. But through some creative thinking, Microsoft has made it to the point to where we cannot create tables directly in the analytics endpoint, but we can create views over those tables. We can create functions and we can create procedures, and we can also manage separate security from that we have in our database. So for anyone in here who's worked as a DBA before, you've probably run into the issues in the past where you have a data analyst that connected to your transactional database and ran one of those big giant analytic queries on there, and it impacted your users and your applications, and you had to have a super fun conversation with them. So in Fabric, they would just connect to the SQL Analytics endpoint. You can apply all the security that you have in there, and you can rest assured that your transactional data is not being impacted whatsoever, nor are your applications that rely on the database itself.
Hey, Kevin, someone just mentioned replication looks easier in Fabric than doing it via SQL Server.
Yes, if I think that means I think what you're intending to say there is that the replication in Fabric for the SQL database that lives inside of Fabric is easier than it is in SQL. If you're replicating SQL, if that is the case, yes, absolutely, because it's baked in. Now, if you're referring to replicating data inside of SQL Server from one instance to another, yes, that the mirroring it's a lot easier. However, there are some gotchas when you're trying to replicate or mirror data from SQL Server on-prem into Fabric that pertain to the version of SQL Server that you might be running. If you're running SQL Server 2025, it's using a technology that's called Change Data Stream, and it's really good. It's the same technology that we use for mirroring a SQL database in Fabric to the analytics endpoint. And it works very well. If you're using SQL 2022, 2019, 2017, or 2016, you have to enable CDC on your SQL Server, and then it's going to be reading from that. Now, there are some issues that come with that, because you're having to rely on CDC. And obviously, the later the version of SQL Server, the better. Funny that I just mentioned SQL Server 2016 because as of 2 days ago, it was the end of official support for SQL 2016. So if you're running that, you should probably consider moving up to a much later version than that. I hope that I answered your question. And if I'm going to go ahead and move on, feel free to just ask another question. Okay, I see another question coming in. When we use the SQL endpoint, are we saying that we are querying the one lake? Yes, you are absolutely querying one lake at that point. All right, so moving on.
Perfect. That's all the questions so far. Thank you.
Yep. All right. Additional information about the SQL Analytics endpoint that is very good to know is it uses a different connection string from the actual transactional endpoint. And you can see here that the SQL endpoint is actually going to be a GUID for your workspace .data warehouse.fabric.microsoft.com. So if you're connecting via Management Studio or some other tool or even application that you wrote in something like Rayfin, you could access it the data directly in OneLake by using the data warehouse.fabric.com endpoint, and that means that you're going against the SQL Analytics endpoint. Now, if you want to connect to the SQL database, it would be, again, the GUID for your workspace.database.fabric.microsoft.com. And so if you need to do reads and writes and it's going to be an application, you connect to this one, the database. And if you're going to just be doing analytical type processing, you're going to be creating, maybe joining from a lakehouse or another warehouse into things from an external application, you connect to this one. If you're doing it from the portal in Fabric, it's just, we're going to get into that here in the demo shortly. I just got ahead of this bullet. Yes, you can perform cross-database queries within the workspace using the analytics endpoint. It's really, I call it cross database on the slide because that's the term that we SQL users know, but it's really you're doing across endpoints. All right, so let's go ahead and dive into the first demo here. So let me go ahead and pull up Fabric over to this side and just maximize this window and we can get started. If you happen to be new to Fabric, this is just the homepage on the Fabric experience here. So I'm going to go ahead and zoom in on a couple of items here. So first things is how you connect to Fabric. You go to app.fabric.microsoft.com, hit enter, and then it's going to prompt you to enter your credentials, and you use your regular work credentials if your work happens to have a Power BI or Fabric tenant, and you should be able to land into this welcome page similar to that. Now, one other item that I want to highlight down here is going to be, you can see that I have this Fabric icon here. If I happen to click on it, I see two options, Fabric and Power BI, and those are basically the experiences. All that really changes is the GUI that you see here. I'm not going to click on the Power BI to show you that because then it's going to close some of the tabs that I already have open, but it's a slightly different view of it that you can see in there. So then here on the left-hand side, you can see this ribbon where I have a couple of options. So you can see workspaces. If I click on that, you can see the list of all of the workspaces that I have access to in this particular tenant. I have one lake catalog, monitor, real-time intelligence, and different workloads. And then you see this little icon down here at the bottom. This is actually a workspace that I already have open. So if I happen to click on that guy, it opens up this additional blade. That's the workspace representation. And you can see inside of here, I have some folders and a few different items in here. So I'm going to go ahead and step into that workspace. And when I go into here, you can see the same thing that I was seeing in that blade, but now it's full screen. It's giving me additional details. It's giving me whether it's a folder, a lakehouse, an analytics endpoint. Then it can be a database or an analytics endpoint. And I do want to highlight something here. When you create a database, you see this dependency. This is the analytics endpoint. It's created automatically. In Fabric, if you happen to create a lakehouse, there's also an analytics endpoint, which is the exact same type of endpoint that we use in SQL for that lakehouse. Now, there's no replication in the lakehouse because it's already in one lake, but it's the exact same endpoint. And if you pay attention here, this is a warehouse on this line. It uses the exact same icon as the endpoint because, as I mentioned a slide or two ago, it is the same engine that drives it all. Biggest difference is in the warehouse, you can actually create tables and write on the endpoints for the lakehouse or the database. It's read only on the data and the table creation, but you can create store procedures, views, and functions, as I mentioned a second ago. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go here into my database that I have in here. It's called the Investment Tracker Database. And you will see I already had that particular tab open on this GUI that Fabric provides. And let me just go ahead and zoom in a little bit more permanently here so you guys can see that better. And so in here, I have on the left-hand side an Explorer. I'd like to pretend that this is Management Studio Lite on the web. And so it's showing me my database. It's showing me the schemas that I have. If I continue expanding tables, any views that I may have, which I don't have any in here, or store procedures, I only have one, etc. And then over on this right-hand side, it's where the actual query window shows up. Now, one thing that I wanted to go ahead and start showing you guys here is going to be mirroring. So let's go ahead and run this first demo here, a mirroring demo. So I have in my database, you can see here that I have a table called mirror test. So whenever I go ahead and run this specific query here, it's going to say that in my table mirror test, I have 11,000 records. This SQL in Fabric category, 10,000 records, and then 1,000 for this Power BI DC days. So what I would like to do, because I am super creative, I'm just going to go ahead and say, hey, I want to insert 10,000 additional records today, right now, where the category is going to be Fabric Week, and go ahead and run that. So when I run that same query down here at the bottom, we can see that here in my database, I have now, what's that, 21,000 records. So let's go into the replication settings here, and let me just kind of step through a couple of these buttons here, and then we'll show you the status. So the first one is going to be this configure replication. This is something that was added relatively recently, I think as of FabCon, SQLCon in the US back in March. But here is where you can actually go and decide, hey, I want to select or deselect any particular table because there's no value in replicating that one for me. Now you also see this button or this tick down here at the bottom that says automatically mirror all tables. By default, this is checked, and therefore all the tables are checked. If that's not what you want to do in your particular use case, you can just simply uncheck that so that it does not automatically mirror any new tables that you create in the future. Or if you choose to, hey, I want to mirror any new tables, but I want to deselect some of these tables here, you can go ahead and do that and click apply changes, and that would apply. In my case for this demo, I want to keep all my tables on, so I'm just simply going to X out of here, and I'm going to say yes, cancel. Now let's go ahead and go into this monitor replication blade that I mentioned a second ago. And you can see here, it's telling me, okay, this is what I'm replicating. We see it right now. I'm in Central Time in Texas in the US, and it's 10:55 now. But when I ran the query, it was 10:53. You can see it's already replicated 21,000 rows over to my endpoint, which is pretty cool. That took, what, a minute? And that's not bad. All my data is already replicated there for my analysts to be able to see. But let's not just trust me. Let's go ahead and verify. So I'm going to go here. I used this tab that I already had open for the analytics endpoint, but if I didn't have it open, I could back up here and I could go into the workspace and then select it here, and it's going to do the same thing. The other way that I can access that is just simply here from the database. On this top right-hand side, you can see I have this little drop-down. And when I click on that, it's telling me I am in the SQL database at this point. If I want to connect to the analytics endpoint, I just simply click on that, and it's going to open a new tab connected to that. So I just happen to have some queries here that I want to use for another demo. But let me just very quickly say, hey, I want to start a new query. So I'm just going to, and this is the part that there's a button up here that I sometimes forget that it exists. So I'm just going to run the same thing. Select, in this case, I'm just going to say account from my DBA.mirror database or mirror test table, I'm sorry. And it's going to just very quickly give me a count. It's taking a little bit, but here, 21,000 records. So again, in a matter of minutes, we had all of the transactional data available in one lake in a completely different format that is actually directly accessible to anybody that wants to do analytics querying or anybody that is going to be connecting to the data, via a semantic model, for instance. Now, let me see anything else that I may want to show you guys here. Oh, yes. Let's talk about how can I tell the difference between these two, right? So, and I'm going to minimize a couple of things here just to make it a little bit easier. But I want to highlight a couple of things. So assuming that you are in the Power BI view, you don't get to see these tabs that I have up here. Those are unique to the Fabric view, which is this one when I selected Fabric down here. But if I were to be in the Power BI view and that does not show up, the interface is a little bit different. One of the ways that I have identified that allow me to be able to tell whether I'm in the database or the endpoint, I can look at this button up here that tells me right away. But if not, here on the Explorer, you can see that I just have my database and then nothing else. And then there I have different types of buttons here on my ribbon. Whereas if I go here into my analytics endpoint, one of the telltale signs is I have this plus warehouses button. So if I click on that, what that does is that allows me to start doing some cross-database querying if I want to actually be able to see some of those other endpoints that exist inside of my workspace in here, so that it's a little bit easier for me to visually see that. So I'm just going to go ahead and add this enrichment lakehouse in here. And you can now see that I can explore the different objects that exist inside of that lakehouse directly from here. And I'm still in my analytics endpoint of my database. So I think that's actually pretty cool. Now, I want to show you guys how to do some cross-database querying from the endpoint directly, but for that, I have it set up in this other user because of my demos. I'm going to be using two users, an admin that has certain rights and a non-admin that has much less privileges, just to prove some of the security stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and go in here and go into my analytics endpoint. Let me go ahead and zoom in similarly. And then you can see in here, I'm going to run this query here. I have, in this case, I'm connected to my investment tracker database endpoint, and I'm querying my fund table. And then I'm going to be joining that to a table called fund risk characteristics that exists inside of my enrichment lakehouse. Now, I don't have to have the enrichment lakehouse listed here for this to work. It will work perfectly fine without it being there, but visually, I just couldn't remember the name of the table, so I added that. So I go ahead and run the query, and you can see in here that it was able to pull all the columns from my fund table, as well as some of this expense ratio, turn-in ratio, beta, and so on, directly from my lakehouse here. Now, I do see that we have a question in the chat. Can I say the difference between the SQL database and the SQL endpoint from the dropdown on the right-hand side? Yes, absolutely can. So over here on the right-hand side, if I select SQL database and I come into here, this is actually going to be querying my transactional database. So in here, if I have privileges, I can do inserts, updates, and deletes. And also, if I run a very slow, massive query, this is impacting my transactional database. So if you think through transactional databases of being MDF and LDF files, similar as you have in SQL Server or Azure SQL DB, that is what this view is. If I go over to the SQL Analytics endpoint, what that is doing is it's actually connecting me to the endpoint that is querying the data that exists inside of one lake. Now, one thing that I want to show you guys here, since I happen to be here, I just clicked on this gear, the settings gear, and I go here into the SQL endpoint view over here, and you can see that there's a very, very ugly GUID that symbolizes my workspace GUID. And then I'm going to see if I can scroll down a little bit easier. Apparently, I can't on this view, so I apologize. But you see that it's connecting to data warehouse. No, I can't scroll it. Data warehouse.fabric.microsoft.com. Now, if I go into my SQL database and I do the same thing, in this case, it's called connection strings. You can see in here that it's going to be connecting to database.fabric.microsoft.com. Now, one thing that I want to highlight that is important here, in my opinion, since I opened this up for the database, you can see that, okay, this is the data source. This is going to be the endpoint that I'm connecting to, database being database, data warehouse being the endpoint. And then the initial catalog that I'm connecting to on the database, you can see investment tracker, but then there's this additional GUID that's being added to that right here. What that is the way that the serverless endpoint works is running on something that's called a fleet service. And so in order to keep things responsive, what they're doing is they're auto-rotating these databases so that things can be quick, and they happen to be named with a GUID. So whenever you go and create your database, it actually adds a friendly name to it here. And you see it on the front end displayed as just investment tracker, but on the back end, it always keeps that reference. It's not ideal. It is what it is, but I just wanted to highlight that for you guys. Okay, I see another question in the chat. I presume when we create the lakehouse, Fabric creates the SQL Analytics endpoint, but when does the SQL database endpoint get created? Yes, that's a good question. And so let's just take a couple of minutes to go through that right here. I am actually going to do it from this other user that I have admin rights on, just because I don't recall exactly what the rights are on that particular user that I had. So I'm going to go here to my workspace, and I'm just going to say, I want to create a new item. And so when I go to create a new item, it just gives me all of the different options that we have in here. I don't have any of them favorited right now, but I'm just going to say, use the filter, and I'm going to say, hey, I want to create SQL. So these are different options, and what I want to do is create a SQL database. So I am not very creative on the fly, so I'm just going to call this test DB and click create. This is all the effort that it takes to create a database in in Fabric. And then you can see it's telling me it's creating the database. It might take a couple of seconds here, but as it does create the database, it automatically creates the SQL endpoint for you. So it's telling me, cool, my database is here. I can go ahead and see right now it's kind of telling me, like I can't click on that. So I'm just going to back up and go to my workspace view. And when I go in here, you can see my test DB is here and my analytics endpoint just happens to be here. I'm working on a web browser. Sometimes you have to hit refresh. In this case, I did not want to hit refresh for the browser because I need to reopen all these things. But that's exactly when it gets created. It gets created at the time of the creation of the database. All right, so in the interest of time, I'm gonna go ahead and move on and move along. So let me just drag this over here out of the view and go back to the slides here. So now shifting gears to more governance type things, although they are very, very handy for developers as well. There's something called the lineage view. And the lineage view is something that exists at the workspace level. And it is intended to display the lineage relationship between all the items in the workspace. It's going to show you data sources that are external to the workspace, only if they are one step upstream. So if you happen to have something that was created in workspace A that's consumed by workspace B, and then also consumed in workspace C through workspace B, you go to the lineage view in workspace C, and you're only going to be able to see the sources of B, but there's a limitation that you cannot see it all the way to A. It also shows downstream items that depend on any particular item by clicking on something that's called the impact analysis pane. The limitation here at this particular point is because it's at the workspace level, it does not identify three-part notation. When I showed you a second ago that query where I was querying from my SQL endpoint in my database and pulling data out of my warehouse, out of my lakehouse, it's not going to be able to identify that. It's looking for relationships between items that exist outside of the three-part notation. If you have a desire for that to show up, go to ideas.fabric.com and submit an idea or see if it's already been submitted and upvote that, because it would be very, very useful to have that. So here's a quick example of what that lineage view shows up in a very simplistic way. And you can see in here that there's a couple of different buttons in each one of those items. One of them happens to be the impact analysis view, and the other one just highlights the lineage. I'll get into that here briefly in a quick demo. And then this shows you what the impact analysis view actually displays from a more complicated scenario. It just happens to be a screenshot from learn.microsoft.com because I just did not have sufficient workspaces and downstream dependencies when I put this demo together. But you can see in here on the left-hand side, this is just going to be doing browse by item type. So it's telling me there are 5 reports and there are 3 dashboards, but it's not telling me where they originate from. Now I can click on this button here, and actually you can see this one is selected. There's 3 little lines, and then there's this other one that is just kind of a square. And when I click on that second button, and we'll get into that in the demo, then it's going to be browsing by workspace. So in this case, you can see, okay, great. I have 5 reports and 3 dashboards. I assume they could be from one single workspace, unless I look up here that it tells me that it's 2 workspaces. And once I see that, it's like, okay, let me understand which items come from where. I can toggle over to that, and it's going to show me this. Now, with that said, let's go ahead and head back into a demo here. So I'm dragging my Dell user. This is just my business user. And I'm going to go ahead and back up to the workspace item. Now you can see here on this user, when I did that, it's going on ahead and showing me the lineage view. And the way that I get to that is by clicking on this button. If I click on this little button over here, it's going to go ahead and come back to the list view that Fabric defaults to. You can see here we have folders, we have items. One thing that the lineage view does not display is going to be folders. Folders are just for organizing different types. But what this is showing me here is going to be the lineage itself. So I can see over on this row, let me go ahead and click on this guy, which is going to be highlighting or showing the lineage. When you have a really busy workspace and you have a lot of things, it might be easy to lose track of what happens to be connected together. So you can click on that button and it highlights it for you so that you can see that a little bit easier. I can do the same thing for this other one down here that you can see, hey, I have, Lakehouse, my endpoint, I happen to have a semantic model and I report here from the Lakehouse directly. Now, one of the things that you may notice is that I only have this show lineage button. I don't have the other button for the impact analysis view that I mentioned to you guys a second ago. That is due to the permissions of this particular user. This user only has what's called the viewer permission in the workspace, whereas my admin happens to be an admin on the workspace. You don't have to be admin. You can be a contributor for that. But if I go over to the lineage view on this particular user, you can see that I have this show impact across workspaces button. And that's just showing me, okay, when I clicked on this guy specifically, there happens to be one item downstream, which is just my. If I happen to click in on this guy, it's going to show me there's one item downstream, which is going to be my semantic model. Now, if I get down here to the semantic model, you can see, okay, 2 items downstream and so on. If I want to see the other view, that's just the impact analysis, I can just click on that button and it's going to tell me, in this case, everything is contained within the single workspace. It's showing me what's downstream from this specific item is going to be those 2 reports. Now, there's something that it's also good if you happen to favor this view, you can always just click on the item and say Open SQL Database, or you can say Open Analytics Endpoint, and it's going to go ahead and take you directly to those. So I'm just going to go ahead and go back to Open SQL Database. Here we are here again. It's just a different representation on how to get into those items there. So now let's go back and start talking about data protection. Dynamic data masking. This is something, and I'm going to try to rush through the slides here to spend most of my time on the demo, but dynamic data masking is a concept that it's been in SQL for a while. It allows you to mask data dynamically. When it comes to Fabric, in particularly SQL database, it can be applied on the database itself at the time that you define the table, but in the SQL endpoint, it does not replicate automatically the data masking. That's something that you have to apply manually, and you have to do so by running an alter statement on the table itself. That's because we don't get to create tables. We don't get to update tables. We can alter tables just to add this type of security, but not to add new columns and so on. Again, it does not propagate automatically, and the column level granularity is available for those. What I mean by that, in previous versions, I think it's SQL 2022, is when Microsoft introduced the ability to do dynamic data masking grants at the column level. Prior to that, you could only do it just kind of at the row level. And so it was either you could unmask everything or you could not unmask anything. But then in 2022 is when we had the ability of saying, hey, I want Adele to be able to see this column, but not this column. Or maybe I want her to be able to see unmasked data for a particular table as opposed to all tables. Now, one thing that is very interesting here is actually is honored by Power BI reports that are downstream from the endpoint. When we run a semantic model that is of the type direct lake on SQL. Now, if we're applying dynamic data masking or row level security at the SQL endpoint and we're running on direct lake on SQL, that is going to default those queries back to direct queries. So be cautious on that. And if you want to learn more about direct lake on SQL, you can read about it on Microsoft Learn. There's an entire article about that. Now, along those same lines, in SQL, you can do column level, object level, and row level security. Again, it can be applied to the database as well as the analytics endpoint, and those two you have to maintain separately. They don't propagate automatically for you. I recommend to apply it at the consumption layer. So what that means is if you happen to want to restrict parts of an application or even data that a user can see on the database itself, you need to apply it there. If it's going to be a completely different set of users that is going to be doing analysis on your data, then you apply it on the endpoint if they're going to be querying directly. Or if you happen to want to apply that to any Power BI report that is directly on SQL, you can still do that. It only works on this item called delegated identity mode. That has to do with the difference between one-leg security and just traditional layered security. And if you want to learn more about those access modes, you can learn about them on Microsoft Learn. So here's just a quick matrix just showing the differences between the user identity mode and the delegated identity mode. And so I just kind of highlighted what the differences are. User identity mode is what is used in OneLake security, whereas delegated identity mode, that's when you can still do some of these controls and these things that we're going to be doing in the demo inside of the SQL Analytics endpoint itself. So differences are, if you create it in OneLake, it's not going to allow you to control grants and revokes in SQL. Now, if you do them in the SQL endpoint, then you're not using identity mode. The other differences are, again, around row level, column level, and dynamic data masking. Dynamic data masking is not supported in OneLake security at this time. And then row level, column level, you would be applying them on the OneLake security roles, not directly on the endpoint. And you might think, hey, OneLake security is a new thing, so I should probably aim for that. That depends. One caveat to OneLake security is it only applies to the viewer role. So anyone who has permissions at the contributor, at the member, or even the admin level access on the particular workspace bypasses all of the OneLake security entirely. So be cautious as you set that up. So let's go ahead and now finish up strong by going into demos for all of that stuff. So I'm back here as my admin user, and I am in the database itself. And I'm just going to take a look through some of these scripts that I've prepared right off the bat. And the first thing that I want to do here, so I just want to do a select star from person and run that. And we can see here that I'm pulling all of this data. This is all fictitious synthetic data. So if you try to steal any of those social securities, they're not going to match these people. Fair warning. But you can see here that my social security number column appears to be unmasked, and that's not great for securities, particularly if you happen to live in an area that's governed by something like GDPR. This is not good. Now, one thing that I do want to show you guys here is that whenever I go to the table creation on here, for this particular table, again, in my database, we can see down here that I actually, and it's kind of hidden from me right now. I'm not seeing it super quickly. Where's my SSN? No, I'm actually not showing it, not displaying it super well here. So I apologize for that. But what I wanted to get to is that when I created this table, I already applied the masking directly on it. But because my admin user is not just a viewer, he can see all, he can bypass that. So I'm going to go here with my other user that is going to be just my regular user, and I'm just going to go ahead and query the table directly against the database. And we can see here that the social security number column happens to have the masking that I already had applied to the table at the time of table creation. So if I wanted to go ahead and apply some dynamic data masking to that table, this is the way that I would approach it. I would just go ahead and create a role called unmasked data, and then I would grant the unmask permission to that mask role, and then I would add a user to that role to be able to unmask the data. So I kind of set it backwards. So what I'm trying to do here is we just saw here on this other screen a second ago that Adele does not have permissions to view the full social security number, but I'm going to pretend that there's a reason why she needs to be able to see that. So I'm creating a unmasked data role. Then I'm going to grant the unmasked permission to that particular role, and then I'm going to add Adele to that particular role in there. So now when I go back here, and I apologize for moving the screen back and forth, it's just the nature of having multiple users for these demos. When I go back and rerun the query, we can see social security numbers are visible now. So let me go ahead and move on to the analytics endpoint and do the same thing. I want to go ahead and just look at dynamic data masking on this side. So again, with my admin user, if I happen to run that same query, it's going to say, hey, it's unmasked. And in this case, it truly is unmasked, because if you recall, when the tables get created to the analytics endpoint, this masking function does not get created on that side. So it's our responsibility to go ahead and create that. So what I'm going to do here for this demo is I'm actually going to apply the masking to the SSN column on that table. And so now that I've done so, I'm going to go ahead and go here to the analytics endpoint with my Adele user. And I am just going to do a simple select star from person and run it here. So because I applied the masking, we can see that now this data is masked. And just to prove it, I'm going to go ahead and see, okay, here I had this Power BI report open initially. So you could see this is connected to the analytics endpoint. And you could see that it was unmasked. And so now that I just do a quick refresh on the visual, it's now masked because I applied that data masking for this user Adele. So what I'm going to do here is the same thing that I did over on the database a second ago that I showed you guys. I'm going to create an unmasked data role, and then I'm going to grant the permission to unmask to that role. So do that right now. All in SQL, very familiar to us SQL developers. And so the last thing that I'm going to do in here, or that I could do in here, is go ahead and grant the unmasked permission so that Adele could see social security numbers again. But I'm not going to do that. I'm going to skip that because I want to go ahead and apply additional data protections that you can see will actually propagate over to my Power BI report. So in the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and open the Power BI report here as my admin user. And I'm going to do the same refresh. And as I do the refresh, we can see that spinning. And this user still is able to see all of the social security numbers unmasked because he happens to be a admin user. So now let's go ahead and apply some row level security. This is something that you guys in the Power BI world are very familiar with, and many of you in the SQL world are also very familiar with. Now, the way that this works is, as my admin, I go ahead and say, yes, select star from person. There happens to be 250 rows that get returned in 20 columns. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and create a security schema. I'm going to create a function that is going to be my security predicate here. And I'm calling it can view Texas. And then I'm just going to say, passing the parameter of the state in there, the state province. And then inside of that function, what I'm essentially saying is if the state that happens to be passed in to there happens to be Texas, spelled out specifically that way, and the person who is running the query is a member of this role that I'm going to be creating called can view Texas, then it's going to return a 1. Otherwise, it's not going to return that. And then I'm also saying select 1 for anything that is Texas. So effectively what this is doing, if it happens to be Texas, is going to return it. Or if I happen to have permissions to view, then it's going to return it. Then I'm going to create a security policy here. And that's basically what's going to be enforcing that particular security predicate. So let's go ahead and run all of this. Create my schema, create my function, and create my predicate here. Run that. And I also ended up creating a role called can view Texas. So I'm going to go ahead and now run this query here. And I can see, because I now have a role that even as an admin, I have not been added to it. My row count went from 250 columns, or I'm sorry, rows, to 107 rows. So all of the Texas users were eliminated, and I only have Georgia users. So if I go here and I go into my Power BI report and I refresh that, I'm going to get the same result. Interestingly, I'm not getting the same result on this user. I would have expected that. So let me just go ahead and keep moving on. Wait. Oh, I see what I did. I created this in the database, not in the analytics endpoint. So if I go here to the analytics endpoint and run the same demo, you can see here the difference. So real quick, let me go ahead and do this. This is actually proving that those two are separate. I still have 250, but I'm going to run the exact same thing that I ran on the other side a second ago. So again, two different objects, two different endpoints. I can apply permissions differently. So up to this point, I created the role. And then I'm going to go in here and run the query again. And isn't it fun whenever live demos back themselves into what you want to do? So again, 107 on the analytics endpoint. If I go and refresh the report that's running against the analytics endpoint, we can see that that actually altered. And then I'm going to go back here and I'm going to add my admin user. And then I can see all of my rows here again. It's taken a second to do that. So 250 rows there. Now, if I go over to my Adele user here, I'm just going to focus on this Power BI report on this one for now in the interest of time. We know that I did not add Adele to that role. I only added admin. And so we can see here now things are starting to stack. Adele does not have permissions to unmask social security number, and she does not have permissions to see any of these users from the state of Texas. Now, I want to do one more thing here, which is going to be configure column level security. I can do this both in the database and the analytics endpoint. It works exactly the same way. In the interest of time, I'm going to focus on the analytics endpoint only because there's one thing that I want you guys to see there. So in this case, I'm going to say, again, I'm in SQL. I'm using my SQL DBA hat. So I'm going to create a new role. It's going to be called the no SSN role. Very explanatory. Anybody that happens to be a member of this role is not allowed to see the SSN column. And then I'm going to grant select on the DBO person to that particular role. And then I'm going to deny select on the SSN column of the table. So what that means here to this point is that anybody who happens to be a member of this, and let's go ahead and run with it. Create that and grant select on that. And then I'm going to go ahead and add Adele to that particular role. And so now that I've done so, it's not going to look super different to you guys yet because we're still in the same end state that we were. But over here, let me maximize that so you guys can see it better. If I go ahead and click select star on this, we can still see the whole table because I granted select on the table to that particular role that Adele was just added to. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to say deny select on the SSN column of that particular table. Once I do so, I can see here and rerun that same query. And now I get an error. It's saying the select permission was denied on the SSN column of that particular table. So in order for Adele to be able to query this table now, she needs to not be lazy and say select star and actually list out the different columns. I'm not going to type them out for you right now because in the interest of time, but that's how she would get around that. Now, here's one interesting thing about this. Once I go and refresh this Power BI report, what do you think is going to happen? It breaks the report. It's breaking the report because when the report was created, it effectively used select star from the table. So what we need to do for the report to be able to display is the same thing that I talked about. Just select the specific columns directly. All right, so with that said, let me go ahead and jump back into the slides and close out the webinar. So key takeaways. SQL skills are valuable in Fabric, in multiple areas of Fabric on day one. So if you come from the SQL community and Fabric is new to you, you are valuable immediately. SQL database in Fabric is just one more option. It does not replace SQL Server. It does not replace Azure SQL Database. It's just another option for people to be able to use. It is great for citizen dev apps. It is great for metadata-driven ETL pipelines in centralized login inside of Fabric, and it's also a great option for a reverse ETL pattern inside of Fabric. It does have some limitations. Currently, there's a limit on the SQL database in Fabric that it can only be up to 4 terabytes in size, and you can only replicate up to 1,000 tables. Now, the SQL endpoint is what I consider the secret sauce when it comes to data integration for SQL Pros specifically, because it allows us to very quickly use the same skills that we have and just cross endpoint query across multiple different things and just be able to do some of that EDA that we want to do across multiple things. Now, it can be source controlled. It's very difficult to source control. So I would say, be cautious of that. Now, one thing in there, you can also have a view in the database and the endpoint that happens to be named the same, or function or proc, but they don't do the same thing. So they're going to produce 3 different results. Be mindful of that. So what we covered today, we covered an overview of the database in Fabric. We covered what zero ETL replication with Merit looks like for SQL database in Fabric, how to utilize the SQL Analytics endpoint, how to utilize the lineage view at the workspace level, and then dynamic data masking, OLS, RLS, and CLS, which is column level security, both in the database and the SQL endpoint. So with that, thank you guys for attending this webinar today. If you happen to have any questions, let me know.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin, for a great presentation demo. So we'll now get into question and answer part of the session. If you have any questions, feel free to type in chat box now. So next question is, I thought you said you can view TX, but why do we see Georgia?
Yes, excellent question. I actually did not add the correct name to that particular role. So whenever I named it, and that's a great catch, I need to go and change that. Whenever I named it, I made it seem as if we can view Texas. And so I talked about being able to view Texas, but in reality, what I was doing is I was removing Texas from that. So great catch. I will make sure that I update that for any future demos. But yes, that's exactly what happened.
Perfect. That looks like all the questions. So on behalf of the ESPC community, we'd like to extend a big thank you to you again, Kevin, for taking time out today to carry this webinar. Really appreciate it.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for having me.
So see you at the next webinar. Thanks.
All right. Thank you.